Take another photograph and document a life that's right. And ways consist of simple things, the days of black and white. And faces from a humble past.
Hello, what's the story? Welcome back to Talkin Guff podcast with me, your host, Ruben Django Pouch. Just wanted to say, obviously, people know I'm a chef. I don't know what to do, but I work in a restaurant and I really love it. I work for the two soundest lads going. Big shout out to Brian and Paul. And the other day they brought us out for a bit of food in Little Forest, which is an offshoot of Forest Avenue. And Little Forest is in Blackrock, and we had this lovely little 6-course tasting menu, and it was fucking delicious. So fair play to the lads. They know how to look after their chefs. And as a result, they have a fucking killer death squad of lads. So yeah, it was great. I also went recently to a 2 Michelin star restaurant called Leah in Blackrock Market, which was fucking phenomenal. So that was great to have a couple of restaurant experiences. I haven't had restaurant experiences in ages. Not proper ones. Like, I've been to a couple of fast food places and all, but nothing as good as that. So I really enjoyed those 2 restaurant experiences that I've had in the last month. And again, big shout out to Paul and Brian. Thanks, lads. Gav made a comment in the last episode of the podcast. I'm saying Gav like everyone knows who he is, but my good friend Gav McCabe, who I had Dionysian moments of omnipotence on stage with for many years, made a comment on the comment section, and I love it because I have a lot of respect for Gav, and I'm happy that he watches the podcast and takes the time to comment. So thanks, Gav. He commented on the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard thing. He called it a circus of misery. The whole thing was a circus of misery, and he made a couple of really good points. Like, he said that, and I had thought this myself, at what point, if there's been a trial and he's been vindicated, what's the standard? Because now it's just like, we keep seeing articles that are saying how bad this is for the Me Too movement, how we have to listen to imperfect victims. Gav said he saw an article in The Guardian that called it an orgy of misogyny. And at what point, like, is the standard of the justice system good enough? Like, and I said is this going to be some never-ending thing? And no journalist, Gav makes this point, and it's a really good point, no journalist is willing to sort of say that, willing to go, look, enough is enough, we've done this, it's over, chap's been vindicated, because they don't want to be seen in today's world to be siding with like a powerful white man. I think that's fucking crazy, isn't it? Because if you do side with Johnny Depp, you might yourself be tarred with the brush of misogyny. You might be facilitating toxic patriarchy, and it's really fucking mental. And another point Gav made, and I definitely made this point in the podcast that I recorded with Noel, was like, if you flipped that audio, like where she's saying, come on, Johnny, grow up, don't be such a baby, I didn't punch you, I hit you, and all that sort of toxic audio we've heard of her, if you flip that onto Johnny saying it to Amber, he'd be gone. No interviews, no career, no conversation. As soon as we heard that shit, it'd be lights out for that motherfucker. And so, is there a double standard at play? Are men and women headed for a sort of dangerous place? I think potentially, and we'll talk about it more with Paul Ring when we do an episode about toxic masculinity, and we are going to do that podcast because I bumped into Paul the other day and I'm really excited about that, so watch this space. Looks like COVID's making a comeback, huh? I saw a thing just there where it was like in China that a number of banks had frozen $178 million worth of savings in banks in China. They had frozen these assets, these savings, and there was mass protests as a result of that. I mean, I suppose I'm a bit concerned as to why the banks are freezing people's money. Is it a bit like what we saw in Canada where they took protesters and froze their bank accounts, etc.? And is it not totally totalitarian and authoritarian? And then in order to stifle that dissent or stifle those protests, they used the COVID tracker app and just turned everyone to red and said, no, you've got COVID now, you have to fucking quarantine. Isn't that fucking mental? They did that. And like I said, COVID looks like it's making a comeback. Every day I seem to have in my feed or my media zeitgeist things that seem to be, or articles, headlines that seem to be perpetuating the COVID thing. Like, and when I thought it was fizzling out, it's like, oh, no, that's still a big thing, you want to be careful. Watch out. And I'm not saying it's not, I just thought that it was, and it's a strange juxtaposition. And we're going to have a look at a few juxtapositions or slightly conflicting narratives in this podcast. At what point are we going to actually be able to sign off on COVID, I suppose, is a question I have. And at what point is it going to be put in the same bracket as things like the flu or the cold? Because those things can make you really sick as well. And if we tested during flu season everyone for the flu, if we tested everyone for the sniffles, could we not also come up with thousands of cases of those infections? I don't know, but I just thought, like that, when are we going to be done with it? And at what point are the media going to stop perpetuating the situation? Or maybe they have to. What does anyone else think? And another thing is, like, if they start to try and reintroduce mandates, is everyone going to go along with it? Because I don't give a fuck what you say. I'm not. I'm never wearing a mask or showing an ID or explaining to anyone anything about my personal choices ever again. If some jumped up little prick in skinny jeans and a fucking crap beard in some coffee shop wants to be like, hey mate, do you have your vaccine passport or put your mask on? And I'm like, fuck off, you little twerp. I also saw a lot of articles recently that's just like, I saw one that said that, oh, it turns out that the vaccine could give you myocarditis. Pericarditis. I saw a thing that said that the J&J vaccine could increase the chances of contracting some Guillain-Barré syndrome, some sickness. I saw a thing that was saying that the AstraZeneca vaccine could create neurological problems. And also I keep seeing things that say that articles that are saying things like that the vaccine situation, that people who are vaccinated and boosted are still coming down with COVID and still displaying COVID symptoms. And I'll try and put like a fucking medley of all of those screen grabs here. But and one thing that I thought was weird about this is like, what if it turns out that, like, you know, because that sort of sounds like the stuff that the tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists were saying. They said, oh, these leaky vaccines might give you a problem with neurological situations or immunodeficiency diseases. And are we going to be in a situation, like, it's only a year later, and we're starting to see this stuff drip into our media zeitgeist. And I suppose, is it just going to be this weird, surreal situation where it turns out that all the things that the fucking nutcases said would happen actually happen, and yet there will be no sort of vindication for the people who communicated concerns about vaccine mandates, lockdown mandates, etc. Like, is it just going to be like, oh, those people are still crazy? Yeah, okay, fair enough. Everything they said would happen is happening, but they're still crazy. Don't listen to those people. Listen to us. Get your booster. Because also a thing came up a while ago with the World Health Organization wanted to introduce a pandemic treaty which would allow them autonomous power over individual governments in the wake or the midst of a pandemic. I think Brazil were just like, not a fucking chance. We're not having some unelected foreign body, some unelected body that is heavily funded by potentially nefarious people like Bill Gates and the US in general. Like, why would we surrender the control of our people or the power to govern our people to this unelected body? And I thought that was interesting, and I also thought big up to Brazil for stepping up to the line and saying, get the fuck out of here. But definitely I think that's a place where we don't want to be, isn't it? Where, like, some body off over there, some international body that we don't elect or we've no say in or we don't have anything to do with, and we don't really, you know, isn't it a dodgy situation where they could potentially come along to our government and say, oh no, tell everyone that they have to get into their house, or tell everyone they can't go to the shops unless they get this jab or unless they do X, Y, and Z? Is that not a place we don't want to be? Am I being paranoid or cynical when I say that? Because quite quickly after the WHO introduced the idea of a pandemic treaty, and I think they're going to make a decision on it this month, but in around the same time we saw a lot of talk about monkeypox. Now, I don't know anything about monkeypox, but I did see that the Irish government had already secured a quantity of monkeypox vaccines. And is monkeypox a thing that's been knocking around for a long time? And if not, where did they get a vaccine already? And why are the Irish government buying it? Seems strange to me, or it just seemed that, especially on the coattails of this, the introduction of this idea about a pandemic treaty, that, oh, maybe here's another one. And it's just like, Yeah, we're designing legislation which allows us to take control of individual governments in the midst of a pandemic. Oh, here's another pandemic. Tell us this. Get in your gaff. Again, am I being a total dickhead? There are just a few things I wanted to touch on with regards to COVID, and then moving on. A friend of mine, Vladislav, told me the other day, he's like, why don't you look into this? He said, the price of oil is more expensive now, or is less expensive now than it was in 2008. I was like, what? And so I Googled it really easily, and it turns out that in August of 2008, the price of oil on the stock exchange, the barrel price of crude oil was $145 a barrel. And today, the barrel price of crude oil is $119 a barrel. But we are now paying $2.25. The other day I went into the fucking garage and it was $2.25 a litre. And in 2008 it was about $1.10, $1.20. And I suppose I don't really understand that. I don't understand how the price of crude oil could be less expensive now than it was in 2008. But the price of petrol and all the associated costs of of oil, or all the costs throughout the world that are associated with the consumption of oil, are going through the roof. And so that doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't add up, but it's cheaper now. Oh, no. And so what does anyone else think about that? Maybe I don't have the prerequisite knowledge of business, commerce, or the oil industry to understand that situation. But from a layman's point of view, I look at it and I go, that doesn't add up, does it? There's a strange juxtaposition at play there. And the other thing that sort of is akin to that in a way is, like, obviously now we've been having a housing crisis in this country since at least 2016. But to me, when I look around, and what does anyone else think, it looks like there's more houses being built now than I've ever seen being built before in my whole entire life. You go up to the Farron Kelly Road there in Talkin, there's fucking thousands of houses after being built in the last year. And everywhere you look, it seems like there are apartments and houses being built everywhere. And yet somehow we have more people homeless now than ever. There's over 10,000 homeless people. There's 3,000 homeless children in this country. And I suppose the question is just like, well, who the fuck owns all them houses then? The numbers of homelessness rising when it looks like the number of houses being built is rising as well. What does anyone know anything about that, or does anyone else agree with me, or in fact disagree with me on that point? And would you comment in the comment section below? And the other thing is, like, then not only does who owns all those houses, but how come there are no houses for rent then? So because that's the thing, it's just like, if there's all these houses being built, and I can't figure out who's buying them or who owns them or who in fact lives in them, because the numbers of homeless people is going through the roof, then how come also there's no houses to rent? Like, I think a thing came out about a month ago that said 20,000 people are looking to rent accommodation in this country, and there are only 800 units of rental accommodation available in the whole country. That's fucking mental, isn't it? Against, like, are all these, what's the story? I can't figure that out. So comment in the comment section below. The other thing I can't figure out is, like, obviously the price of food is going through the roof, and I said before, I don't want to end up in a situation where I have to fight someone to the death in the car park of Aldi for a bag of sugar. That's scary to me. That shit is scary. But if the price of, if the narrative is that the price of food is going up is due to inflation, COVID, staff shortages, price of oil, etc., then how come stuff like milk and butter is going up nearly 100%? Like, butter has increased in price nearly 100%. And now you might be looking at me going, no, it hasn't, Ruben, because it hasn't yet in the supermarkets, because the companies like Tesco and Aldi and Lidl and all, they will absorb those prices, or they will have deals in place from last year or the year before where they get X amount of butter, cream, eggs, etc. for this money. But if you work in the food service industry, the companies like the wholesalers will not absorb those extra costs. They will put those costs on the customer, me, restaurants, etc. That's why it's more expensive to eat in restaurants now than it was 6 months ago. But we live in Ireland. We have, like, massive amounts of grass-fed, dairy cows. And I suppose I find it confusing that I'm trying to figure out what is it, because it's not COVID or the war in the Ukraine, surely, that's affecting the price of butter. And if it's like associated costs like fodder or fuel, why is that the situation, considering that the price of crude oil is less than it was in 2008 and we didn't have this situation in 2008? I can't figure that out. Am I ignorant? And what does anyone else think about that? Because again, it just seems weird to me. It just seems like it doesn't add up. And I don't know if anyone saw, like about a month ago, Biden was talking about imminent food shortages happening in America. And at the exact same time, there was, I think, 13 food processing plants in America either blew up, went on fire, or had fucking planes crash into them and were destroyed. And I just thought that's weird. Like, even if you looked, like, if you were a cynic or a paranoid tinfoil hat wearing lunatic, you could say that maybe blowing up these food processing plants simply to create food shortages. And I don't know. What does anyone else think about that? I definitely thought it was weird because someone said, statistically speaking, from an odds point of view, like the odds of all of those food processing plants blowing up, going on fire, within the period of time, like the odds are like a fucking 1,000,000,000 to 1. 2 of them had fucking planes crash into them. Apparently, even the odds of that happening are fucking exponential. Another interesting fact that I saw recently was that America does $39 billion of trade with Russia every year. And America has a $100 trillion economy. So you go and do the maths, I'm not bothered, but basically $39 billion doesn't seem like a massive portion of $100 trillion. And again, how then does the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia have such a negative financial effect on America if they have, compared to Europe, say, a relatively small amount of trade with Russia? How does that happen? And then the other part of that is like, why are we supporting sanctions on Russia that are imposed by a country who doesn't actually get negatively affected by said sanctions? If we do more trade with Russia than the US, why are we allowing the US to impose sanctions that are only going to have a negative effect on us here in Europe and not necessarily on the US? And I've said this point before, it's like, who the fuck are the Americans to impose sanctions on anyone for war crimes when they have been dropping bombs on a sovereign nation every day for 20 years? They're the most warmongering fucking scumbags out there. According to Noam Chomsky, every American president since the Second World War would be indictable for war crimes in The Hague. You know what I mean? Obviously, we had a pandemic and it was really tough for people in multiple ways. I mean, people, and we won't get into them necessarily now, but just to tie in with what we're talking about right now, is it had a negative effect on, like, all the things we've discussed, inflation, staff shortages, fuel issues. All of this was sort of blamed on COVID. Oh, how come that's so expensive? COVID. And how come I can't get that thing there? Oh, COVID. And how come the price of a bag of chips has gone up 100%? COVID. Okay, right, yeah, fair enough, okay. And then when COVID seems to be fizzling out, or when it can no longer be the thing we blame all of these issues on because it looks like it's fizzling out, we have a fucking mad war that has the same effect. And so it's like, on the coattails of this pandemic is the war. And it is now driving the cost of fuel and grain and fodder and all of these things up. And I suppose, like, am I a total scumbag to say something like, when I look at both those situations, they seem to me like they were potentially hijacked by the powers that be in order to facilitate, like, I mean, I said before that I, for not even for a minute, would say, like, I'm not a COVID denier. I think COVID's a real thing. Do I think it was potentially hijacked and sensationalized in the media in order to control people and perform maybe the biggest heist of the 21st century, definitely the greatest wealth transfer the world has ever seen? Is that the case? You know, was it trumped up and used to line the pockets of the wealthiest people on planet Earth? And then also, is the war in the Ukraine, is the same thing happening there? Now, I'm not trying to say for a minute that the war in the Ukraine isn't awful and that the people affected in the most serious of ways on the ground don't deserve our empathy, sympathy, and help, in any way that we can. But is it a situation that has been totally hijacked by the likes of the US, NATO, and by default Halliburton, Raytheon, and fucking Lockheed Martin? Has it been hijacked by these nefarious motherfuckers in order again to line the pockets of the wealthiest people on planet Earth? We know that those aforementioned arms manufacturers have been openly communicating to their shareholders that the tensions in the region are good for business. Because do you remember then, like back in 2003, in the midst of 9/11, that America and NATO member states waged a brutal and one-sided war in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, I mean, if you ask me, that was done to simply facilitate the industrial military complex and create fucking exponential amounts of wealth. I think in Afghanistan they made $1 trillion from the sale of weapons that they just left there for the Taliban to take. And like that, I've said before that seems crazy to me, that you would spend so much money to fight an enemy with weapons that you eventually just give to them. And that happened, right? I mean, that definitely happened. The reason we allowed those powers that be to wage that brutal one-sided war in the Middle East, because we were afraid. We were afraid of Saddam's nuclear capabilities. We were afraid, as per the establishment narrative, that Saddam Hussein could launch a military strike within 15 minutes. And that all turned out to be total bullshit. Like, total nefarious crackpottery that was dreamed up to simply go in there and destroy the lives and livelihoods, communities and environments of millions of people in the Middle East. That happened. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a fact. Could those same powers that be doing the same thing with regards to Ukraine? Could they even be doing the same thing with regards to the coronavirus? Like, if they're willing to go to those lengths to facilitate their own wealth generation, like, what else? We couldn't put anything past them, surely. So are they lying? Because all of the things I've talked about, all of the juxtapositions there, like, is the theme of all of them fear? Are they all fear-based? And are they driven by some sort of fucking greed? Because it looks like that to me. It's just like, when you keep hammering people with things they should be afraid of, you are more likely to be able to control them en masse and, install potentially fucking unconstitutional or fucking legislation or mandates that go against basic human rights, under the guise of the greater good. I've said before, you want to watch out for the greater good. Usually when someone's talking about the greater good, they're getting ready to bend you over and stick it in your ass. Because it's like, oh no, trust us, we're the good guys, we're doing this for you. You have to stay in your house for 2 years for you. You have to take this vaccine for you. It's not for us. I know it's the most lucrative medication ever made and people are making trillions of dollars off the situation, but we don't want that. We're doing this for you. Don't be silly. Don't be paranoid. Don't be cynical. We have your best interests at heart. This is for the greater good. When I look at all that shit, and I'm not willing to sign off on this narrative yet, but when I look at that stuff, I think to myself, are the crackpots, the tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists who believe that the World Economic Forum are in the final stages of their master plan where we will own nothing and be happy and just be fucking like consumerist symbiotes in a fucking dystopic future that's engineered simply to generate wealth for a finite group of men, I suppose. Like, is that happening? I don't really want to sign off on that narrative because I find it scary. I'm scared for what the future holds for my young lad and all his little classmates, all these little beautiful children. Like, what the fuck is it going to be like for them in 20, 30 years if we don't keep an eye on the situation? That's it, really. I do think that it is really important that we no longer allow ourselves to be divided over these fear-driven driven narratives that are being drip fed to us via mainstream media. I think it's really important that we don't look at our neighbour and say he's a fucking asshole because he didn't take the vaccine. He's a fucking asshole because he wouldn't wear a mask. This person's an asshole because they don't believe that there's any nuance or complexity to the situation in Ukraine, that they're unwilling to sign off on the narrative that Putin bad, everyone else, NATO good, you know. They're not your enemy. I've said it 100 times before. It's not gay versus straight. It's not white versus black, and on and on and on. It's haves versus have-nots. That's it. They're the only two teams. Your man, you know, don't allow ourselves to label each other and be divided by these fucking nefarious lunatics. It's time that we realised who our actual enemies were, political and financial elites, and acted accordingly in simpatico with our fucking working class brothers and sisters, yo. I love y'all. I hope you're all loving yourself. Till the next time. Mwah.
That's right. And ways consist of simple things, the days of black and white. And faces from a humble past at one with the ground, the sound